What is absolutism? Absolutism is kind of a nebulous system. It's not really a particular and specific government system. It is, in a lot of ways, the inevitable conclusion of feudalism. Now, it's not the only possible conclusion of feudalism. It is just one of two, and we'll get to the second one next episode in the series. But let's get some basic ground understanding here. So, I will. 1 second. So, what are the basic ground understanding? So, absolutism, as what we would identify the system, absolute monarchy. It's not dead. There are still absolute monarchies. I believe Saudi Arabia is one, might be the only one. I did not do an exhaustive check because it's not particularly relevant. But today, or well, historically, most countries that you would describe as absolute monarchies or followed absolutism were in Europe between about 1651 and 1830. Now, absolutism, in the easiest case study, is basically the conclusion that Europe had following and during the reign of Louis XIV, as shown in picture here. He is the titular absolute monarch, the prime example of it, at least in European history. And not many countries outside of Europe, at least until or after colonization occurred, had European-style absolute monarchies. Even today, Saudi Arabia is not really the same style of country. It's closer to a monarchical dictatorship than a absolute monarchy, because an absolute monarchy in this description, and how I'm describing it here, is still predicated on feudalism. So that is the first important thing you need to see here. Absolute monarchy is the balance between the regular feudal dimension of nobles, knights, castles. It's that base, but then you also have the king. The king is no longer just a first among equals lord. The king is clearly and decisively above every other lord. He doesn't just rule by the nature of contract and obligation. He rules because he is more powerful, but is justified in his power through contract and obligation. So why? What caused this to form? Now, there's a couple of very big factors. So the first one, really, is the rise of universities. Now, the first universities existed long before 1600s. The first couple were, I think there was the first one was in 1100 AD in Italy, I think Bologna. I could be wrong there. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Doesn't particularly matter. But as the late Middle Ages progressed and into the Renaissance and into the early modern period, we saw more and more and more and more universities across Europe. Not anywhere close to what we see today, but the increase in universities meant that the universities were not just effectively seminary schools. They were able to train bureaucrats. And we're not just referring to bureaucrats as today where they might have a Bachelor of English degree or something. No, we're talking about engineers, we're talking about natural philosophers, we're talking about well-educated math people. These were the core bureaucrats useful. And sure, as always in a university education, since the dawn of time of the university concept, that hasn't been singular disciplinary. No one went to school to only learn math. But those were the things that people wanted at the time. Because what they needed was people they could trust and who were replaceable to go and surrogate for the king, to rule for the king in his place, to extend his ability to tax and govern. Now, this might sound a little bit like, if you recall the last video, the motivation for feudal lords. But there is a big difference. In the early Middle Ages, when feudalism starts crystallizing out of the migration period, what we see happen is the aristocratic nobility rule land to deploy cavalry to arm the king's army. That's not what the bureaucrats are doing. They are not providing military labor. They are contract workers to collect taxes. That's it. They serve no other purpose. They do not replace the feudal lords. Those still exist because feudal levies, well, as we'll get to, not the only part of the army, are still a part of the army. If you look at, say, Poland, Lithuania, not an absolute monarchy by any means, but it's the other system, which we'll get into next video, which probably will be in August, to be honest. Mass feudal levy call-ups, the call-up of the nobility, was the main way armies were formed in lots of states. If you look in the Italian Wars, a bit before absolutism crystallizes, you still see the same thing. The French call up their nobility to arm their horse. Now, the second big thing, and a little bit the third, but the second big thing we see here is the Infantry Revolution. Now, for those watching, just take these as cavalry. I don't have them as cavalry, they take up too much screen space, or I have to like wonky things. But take them as cavalry. So in the medieval army, what you would have is you would arm knights to fight peasants. Or your opponent might arm knights to fight your knights. But that was it. That was the height of medieval militaries. Near the end of the medieval period, 1400s, 1500s, we start seeing the start of the Infantry Revolution, and by 1650, this is full-blown. And what the Infantry Revolution means is that it's not monotonic armies. The army is not cavalry with some infantry for bodies. It is a balanced force of pike, shot, and horse. You need all three elements to actually win a battle. In a really overly simplified way, it is rock, paper, scissors. Shot beats pike, pike beats horse, horse beats shot. You need all three elements. You cannot get rid of them. Now, the knights, the horsemen, are still drawn through feudal obligation, usually. It's the most cost-effective and the easiest way to form and call up armored horsemen. And note here, armored horsemen continue all the way to Napoleon. The French cuirassiers wore quasi-bulletproof breastplates to battle. Now, you can hear all sorts of anecdotal stories of French cuirassiers ditching their cuirasses, but they still technically wore them, at least on parade ground, and they should wore them in battle, technically. Whether they did, it's fuzzy. Now, the later you get into this period, closer to the 1800s, you start seeing light horse dominate. But if you notice, if you look at who draws for the light horse. In most European countries, the light horse are still the nobility. The horse has always been, and always shall be, the domain of the nobility in European warfare. Now, we don't really use horse anymore, so it's not really a thing. But if we did, it likely would still be the nobility fielding it. Possibly not through feudal obligation this time, though. Now, to contrast this, we have pike and shot. These cannot be drawn up through feudal obligation because it doesn't make sense. For pike and shot to work, they need to be large, disciplined, cohesively trained blocks. For example, a pike block might be, say, 200 or 300 men. You can't have 300 men drawn from 30 separate estates get together once a year and expect it to be a cohesive, coherent fighting force. That is the biggest weakness of feudal militaries and one of the reasons why Infantry Revolution happened. Yes, you might have 10,000 heavy horse, but the 10,000 heavy horse are really the product of 2,000 lords. They're not one block of horsemen. They're 2,000 units of horsemen. Whereas you could have 2 or 10,000 pikemen in a coherent sets of blocks, because that's how you train infantry. So what this means is to actually field armies of pike and armies of shot, what you need to do in the late 17th century, you need a strong central government. Strong in the sense that it has fiscal power. A feudal king has very little fiscal power. He only collects revenue from his own estate, his own peasants, and maybe a few taxes here and there that have been approved nationally, but not many. He's incapable of funding a large army. And the only way to have a disciplined, cohesive infantry force is to have a large standing army or to hire mercenaries, which is effectively the same thing. The next consideration is canon. One of the reasons why feudalism worked as was is that a feudal lord in his fortified manor house could reasonably be expected to resist raids and small armies, because trying to storm a fortified position by force with sword and bow is extremely hard. 500 men cannot reasonably take 10 behind the castle. Not without losses that no attacker could ever motivate their men to do. A direct assault would be far too costly in lives in such a circumstance. But in the 17th century, cannons, which have been around for quite a while, have finally gotten to the point where they are easily mobile, powerful, and fairly cheap. Now, by no means are they actually cheap, but all armies could field them. And if everybody has cannon, traditional castles don't work. And really, this starts happening in the 16th century or earlier. This is why star forts were invented. Traditional castle walls, traditional castles, a place like Marienburg Castle, which I do not have a picture of here, but you can look it up, does not work with 17th century or even really 16th century cannon. The cannon will easily and quickly make a breach of it in a fraction of the time conventional siege methods could. This means that a lowly manor house with just a dozen defenders really poses no obstacle to an attacker, especially once you add that there are arquebusiers or other such forces which have the capacity to easily shoot defenders on the walls quite happily. Yes, the defenders could have those as well, but numbers matter. If everyone has guns and are shooting each other, the attacker ratio rapidly falls, even if you are defending a fortified position. That's where the 3-to-1 rule comes in. And now the final thing here, which this creates the important moral justification for absolutism. Because the thing you need to know with absolutism is this is a radical departure from feudalism. It's still feudalism, but it's radically different. It has taken it, again, the king from first among equals to dominant. The king is the figurehead, is the sovereign of the nation. He has all of the power, for the most part, which we'll get into in the second half of the video. But what justifies this is the doctrine of divine right of kings. And this comes out in really the 17th century, and it's the final stepping stone that allows someone like Louis XIV to become an absolute monarch. Yes, the Infantry Revolution, universities, canons, these all pre-exist this, but it's not until the divine right of kings is codified. There's several, I can't think of their names, I tried to look for them up, but I couldn't get them. There's several big French authors in the 17th century, clergy, I think bishops, who penned this, basically, who created this doctrine, which subsequently ran Ancien regime France, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, kind of stuff. And it's hard to underestimate how big this is. If I can actually find the document one day, I might go into a video discussing the document in and of itself. It's one of the most consequential documents probably in history. So, let's think about this from the perspective of the king. So we have the king up here. In his castle, he has his city. We now have lots and lots of farms. We have some other minor lords, and we have some churches. If you remember the feudalism video, there's more, because there's been population growth, more economic development. It's another small, but still important factor in the rise of absolutism. So if the king wants to form an army right now, what is his options? In the traditional feudal system, all he can really do is call forth feudal levies. He can go to his two subsequent lords, and he can call their men forward. And he can organize 2 knights in this example, because there are just 2 sub-lords. So now he has an army of 2 knights. It's not very much. Now, 2 knights are very powerful, but it's not really enough to really do anything about it. In a pike and shot age, he only has 1 arm. It just doesn't work. What he then does is he uses excess or extra taxation capacity. He now has the ability to tax all of these farms much more efficiently. He can tax his other nobles much more efficiently. He can tax trade. He can tax all sorts of things much more efficiently. He has more revenue. So what he can do is he can hire professional soldiers from the Third Estate. And what he gets is he gets some pikemen forming up, and he gets shot forming. And now he has a cohesive three-prong army. He has horse, he has pike, he has shot. Now, the reason why this works really cannot be understated. It is entirely the result of the king being able to pull more revenue. With more bureaucrats and more easily replaceable and more trustworthy bureaucrats as a result, because you can hold them accountable for corruption, actual corruption decreases, tax evasion decreases because you can more readily enforce the law, travel distance is less of a problem because you don't need to go to every single town every single month or whatever to collect your taxes. You have someone else do it for you. And you also have a lesser known thing, but still quite important. Throughout the 16th, 15th, and 16th century, as a result of both the Black Death and also the discovery of the Americas by Spain and subsequent pulling of gold and silver from there and other sources around the world, Europe rapidly financialized. It went from being a system where most taxes were paid in kind to a system where most taxes were paid in copper, silver, and gold. In the 16th century, there was what is dubbed the 15th century, the Great Bullion Famine. There was not enough silver and gold in Europe to actually properly run the financial system. There wasn't enough money to go around, like actual physical currency, because this is the time the currency was gold, effectively. That is solved through the discovery of the Americas for the most part, and all of this gold and silver being brought over to Europe. And this now financialization of Europe means taxes from the peasantry and other nobles can be collected in cash instead of in goods. And the ability to use cash, it leverages economic power much more than you can really emphasize. Cash is infinitely storable. It doesn't spoil. When does a gold coin go bad? But also, it's easily convertible. If you want to pay someone to do something, you can give them a gold coin, or you can give them a silver coin. It's much harder to get someone to work for you if you give them a bushel of wheat. What are they going to do with that? They're probably a peasant farmer anyways. Why would they want more wheat? Financialization drastically makes this possible. This formulation, the ability to form all of these armies together, hiring mercenaries, hiring national, professional, standing armies, is not possible without financialization. And another corollary to this is because of financialization, because of bureaucrats, the king can manage larger and larger estates. If we look at the French monarchy, Louis XIII and Louis XIV ruled a much larger percentage of France in direct rule from the king. No dukes, no counts, direct rule of the king than any king prior. Philip II, much smaller. Mostly just Ile-de-France. Louis XIII governed most of Normandy, Ile-de-France, much of central France. Much, much, much larger areas. Now, he didn't do this by stripping land from the nobles, but conquered lands, Normandy from the English, Burgundy from the Burgundians, were brought under the rule of the king and were not farmed out to nobles because of the efficiencies created by modern bureaucracy. Yes, I know we're simplifying, but that's not really the point. So now we have the motivations, we have the understanding, and we have to figure out why this could actually work. What enabled this? So what is this? What does this even mean? I've described what it is, like why, but what is it? Well, it's ultimately feudalism plus plus. So this is how feudalism works, right? You have all the peasants, they owe things to the knights, who owe obligations to the lords, who own obligations to the king, or God, or the church. That's feudalism. That's the same thing in absolutism. Now, you might start seeing more cities form, but cities already exist in feudalism. They're not separate from it. They are just part of it. Instead of being a tenant farmer, you are a city on a lord's land. You still pay taxes the same way. Now, the difference here, though, is how the government works. I did not touch on this in much detail in the feudalism video, but we will get on it here. So in feudal countries, the king doesn't really have legislative power. He has executive power. He can decide to call up the armies. He can call the obligations whenever he wants. Now, there's limits to this and there's contracts, but he can call up his lord's obligations and he can go to war, or he can build a building, whatever. He collects his own tax revenue. He can use whatever taxes he wants, how he wants them. But if he wants to do something on another lord's land, or if he wants to tax other lords' subjects, not his own domain, someone else's, he needs the legislature. You might ask yourself, legislature? There were legislatures in medieval Europe? Yes. Yes, there were. Now, they weren't codified or as clean as legislatures we have today, but you, as a likely English-speaking viewer, considering you're listening to this video in English, and given my demographics are probably from English country, you already know an example of this. Think about it. The Magna Carta. What is the Magna Carta? It's basically the instantiation of a formalized parliament in England. But before that, there was still legislation. Parliament isn't a new concept invented by the Magna Carta. It is reinforced by it. Now, every single country has a different style and different body of legislature. The England had the Parliament, France had the Estates General, Poland had the Sejm. They're all different. The Holy Roman Empire had the Diet. That's another example. They're all different. But their main purpose of all of these institutions is taxes. Now, they could also pass other laws, but taxes are the main one. Now, just some lovely photos. This is an example of the Estates General. 1789, perhaps, but still the Estates General. What is the Estates General? Well, it's the French legislative body. What are estates? You might ask yourself. Well, France was divided into 3 estates and how their country worked. The first estate was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was everybody else. Roughly 1, 5, and 94% of the population, respectively. In the Estates General, prior to the French Revolution and all that, which we'll one day talk about in a video, we're doing groundwork for right now, though. The estates were broken up into 3 equal bodies, and they were all elected by universal suffrage the entire time. Fairly interesting. But the members of the Estates General would go in and they would vote on legislation. They would vote on laws that affected the entire country. They would assent to the king's program in feudalism. Similarly, you have that with the Polish Sejm here. It worked the same way. Now, the Polish Sejm was only composed of the nobility. But it's the same idea. That is how it worked. Then we have the English Parliament. How did that work? Well, by the time of the 17th century, and you start talking about the time frame of absolutism, the English Parliament had been very formalized. Technically speaking, anybody could run and become an MP. And those MPs could be anybody. Now, I think you had to have land rights or land ownership to vote, so it's mostly just the nobility vote. But in principle, anyone could do it. And the English Parliament was quite interesting in that it had more power, generally speaking, than the other legislative bodies, but they all existed. And they basically advised the king on law and consented to law. They did not create laws themselves, though, for the most part. Okay. So what's different? What does absolutism change? Well, these bodies cease to exist. That's the difference. The monarch now rules by executive decree. There is no legislature. There is no consultation formally. You have interest makers and lobbying and all that. That always happens. But there is no formal body to advise the king. The only people who advise the king are the people the king pays to advise the king. His own choice. Otherwise, he rules by decree with the executive power granted to him by God. No one else. There's no consent from the governed. There's no consent from the nobility. It's only consent by God. In theory. In reality, the absolute monarch really can't raise taxes. He technically could, probably, but you really can't. Raising taxes is extremely unpopular, even when people agree to it. Raising taxes when no one agreed to it is exceedingly unpopular. And that is one of the reasons the French Revolution goes on to happen later, because the king, Louis XVI, is actually incapable of raising taxes himself. He needs legislature to come back to raise taxes. Now you might ask yourself, well, if this is such a big problem, how could absolutism even happen? Well, remember back to financialization? They could borrow money. Now, the ability to borrow money really opened up to the door for this. Louis XIV and Louis XV, the two most titular absolute monarchs, ran up huge debts in the state. They spent so much oodles of money because they could borrow it. They didn't need to directly tax people. Now, they already have pre-existing taxes. You have things like the salt tax. You have tariffs. You have road tolls. You have tithes. Tithes out of the church, but you know what I mean. You already have all these existing taxes, and the king can change taxes on his own tenants. One's on his own domain. That is his feudal power. Pre-exists this. He can't raise taxes on other lords or on other domains. The peasant of the Duke of Aquitaine will not pay the king a cent more without consent. That's how it works in practice. But with the exception of taxes, the king has absolute power. He can do anything he wants. But you still need to consider your interest groups. But other than power brokers, other than taxes, the king rules by decree and power granted by God. And that's it. The monarch may use his income and his revenues to build a big army, invade the Holy Roman Empire, invade Italy, invade Spain, all of them at the same time, such as in 1700, in the War of Spanish Succession. The king may build bridges, he may build roads, usually to make it easier to use the army. The state isn't altruistic at this point. It's basically just a military with the state. Or the state doesn't really exist. It's mostly just an army. But there is the beginning of spending money on infrastructure to support the military. It's also really notable with shipbuilding. The king usually owned all of the ships, because a navy doesn't really work if it's composed of dozens of lords. And that really kind of pre-existed absolutism too, but it really becomes a big deal in absolutism. So that is really the gist of the system. It's feudalism with a stronger monarch. If you want an analogy to modern systems, the difference between feudalism and absolutism is the difference between parliamentary democracy and presidential democracy. In a presidential system, the president has extreme amounts of executive power. He can do a lot of things without parliament, without the legislature. Just by executive decree, he can do a lot. Look at the US president. He can do so much by executive power. But then you look at a classic parliamentary democracy, like the UK. What can the king do? We're not talking about the prime minister here. The king. How much can King Charles III do? Not a lot. That's the difference between feudalism and absolutism. The absolute monarch has extreme amounts of executive vigor. The feudal monarch doesn't. But with that, if you enjoyed the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe, comment below what you think. If you think I missed anything, if you think it was oversimplified, I don't know. Let me know. Do you think that graphics are bad? Also let me know. Most of this artwork, none of this artwork is mine, unless they're the little icons. But you know what I mean. With that, I bid you adieu, and I hope to see you on next Monday with something else.